The sound was not of celebration, but of stone striking stone, deep, rhythmic, and final. It was the year 150 BCE, in the shadow of the great temple of Hathor at Dendera, a time when the Hellenic rulers struggled to understand the absolute power held by the Egyptian priesthood. They watched, cold and alien, as a small group of women, the Emergence, or divine sisters, were being stripped of their identities. They had dedicated their lives to purity and the goddess, yet now, the very priests who should have been their guardians were sealing them away. The chief priest, a figure whose face was obscured by the ceremonial leopard skin, moved with detached precision. His hand did not hold a whip, but a thick, cold piece of beeswax, which he pressed firmly into a small, etched basin beneath the sanctuary's wall, sealing a copper scroll inside. This wax, once pure, now marked the burial of their living status. What unthinkable fate awaited these temple virgins? And what dark secret did that wax seal attempt to bury forever? The silence of the cell was louder than any screaming. If you enjoy these dark histories, leave a like and subscribe and comment below where you're listening from. And now, back to the story. The immediate action following the sealing was not a march to the tomb, but a cold descent into bureaucratic darkness. The priests of Dendera, driven by what they claimed was a need to preserve the purity of the lineage, the Sematawi, began the institutional control. The 27 temple virgins were taken not toward the sanctuary's light, but down into the administrative cells beneath the outer courts. This was not a dungeon for the condemned, but a controlled environment designed for erasure. The first step was the renaming. Gone were the sacred names like Marasank or Mutemwia. They were replaced by simple cold designations based on the order of their entrance into the service. From that hour, they were merely Unit 1 through Unit 27. Their identity was reduced to a number etched onto small, dull iron rings clamped around their wrists, a mark that was impossible to remove without the priest's tool. The ritual of the goddess was replaced by the schedule of the clock, cold washings, precise portions of grain, and mandatory silence broken only by specific approved devotional chants. The stone walls were perpetually cold, slick with a dampness that smelled of stale water and ancient minerals. This was captivity by geometry. Every corner was sharp, every passage narrow, every movement monitored. But even within the crushing weight of institutional control, a quiet will to resist surfaced. It was not expressed through defiance or rebellion, but in the small, shared, secret acts of memory. Unit 14, who had once been the chant leader, would silently trace the sign of the goddess Nephthys onto the damp stone during the moments the guards were changing shifts. Unit 22 would weave threads from her coarse uniform into small knots, a silent calendar marking the passage of days she refused to allow them to steal. They communicated not with words, but with breath and posture, preserving the sacred rhythm that the priests had tried to replace with iron precision. The chief priest, having sealed the secret with his heavy wax, often visited the cells, bringing not threats, but a perverse form of offered mercy. He would speak softly, offering them a chance to leave this cold life and be reassigned to the outer temple services, to work in the kitchens or the laundry. They would lose their vow, yes, but they would gain freedom from the perpetual silence and the numbered identity. The catch, the hidden price, was simple but absolute. They had to publicly denounce their sacred lineage, declaring the purity of the Emergence a failed tradition. This was the ultimate violation, the demand to dismantle the very core of their faith with their own words. What good is purity if the body is already bound? The offer of escape was a final, tempting weapon against their silence. The priests called it the period of purification, a 10-week trial intended to either force compliance or break the spirit entirely. The condition was stated openly, without malice, making the cruelty clinical. Convert your loyalty from the old, autonomous temple tradition to the new, centralized administration, or remain in the cold, numbered silence until your service is concluded, a sentence whose duration was left purposefully vague. Compliance meant the loss of their sacred vow, but a return to the warmth of the sun. Refusal meant perpetual deprivation and effective disappearance from the registers. The test intensified with the passing weeks. It began as soft pressure, Sweet foods offered, then withheld. It escalated to deprivation. The iron rings became a burden during sleep. The daily grain portions were meticulously reduced, enough to sustain life, but never enough to provide comfort. Then came the ultimate weapon: silence. The priest removed the single daily visit by the low-ranking attendant who brought their food. The utter lack of human interaction became a sensory deprivation chamber. No voice, no footstep, no gaze to return. The cold stone of their cells was their only companion. Yet, from this escalation, a profound inversion occurred. The very instruments intended to break them became armor. The imposed discipline of silence, meant to isolate, transformed into a deep, shared meditation. The vow they had taken to serve the goddess was now being enforced by their captors. Every cold meal, every painful night on the damp stone, every moment of profound quiet was simply the external manifestation of their internal devotion. They realized the priests could control their bodies, but not their inner temple. The numbered iron ring, rather than a symbol of servitude, became a holy shackle, a mark of their unbroken commitment to the tradition the priesthood was trying to dismantle. The core why of the priest's actions was finally resolved in the silence of the cells. It was not about God, nor about purity, but about power and wealth. The temple virgins, as part of the old, autonomous tradition, represented an independent financial and spiritual authority linked directly to specific sacred lands. In the shift toward the centralized Ptolemaic-era temple economy around 120 BCE, the priesthood needed to consolidate all temple assets. The Necher Senet were the living deed to their independence. Their price for freedom was the dissolution of their lineage, allowing the state-controlled priesthood to seize their ancestral endowments. Their suffering was merely a necessary administrative cost for institutional expansion. They were imprisoned not because they were impure, but because they were too sacred, too independent, and too wealthy. When the gods are silent, what does a faithful heart hear? The deprivation meant to destroy them was now a daily confirmation of their true vow. Decades later, long after the numbered women of Dendera had vanished from the living records, the secret sealed by the chief priest began its slow, cold emergence. The recurring symbolic motif, the beeswax, led a team of excavators into the lowest, least disturbed crypts of the temple, not in search of riches, but in pursuit of an architectural anomaly detected by ground-penetrating radar in the late 1990s. Beneath a false floor in the administrative archives, they found a small clay-lined basin, perfectly sealed with a thick, hardened layer of wax. A seal so durable it still bore the faint impression of the leopard skin pattern from the priest's hand. Inside was not gold or a treasure map, but a cache of 27 small, hand-painted linen shrouds. Each shroud was meticulously folded and contained a handful of desiccated flowers and a small, smooth river stone. This was the wordless rite of memory. During their years of silent captivity, the virgins had collected these stones, perhaps smuggled in with their food, perhaps merely fragments of the floor, and painted their true sacred names onto the linen scraps of their coarse uniforms before they passed away. They had created their own hidden archive. The cautious evidence queue arrived when the cache was carefully moved. Tucked beneath the basin was a piece of papyrus, brittle and faded, labeled in Demotic script. It was a Keb Sene, a sister's register, compiled in secret by a low-ranking scribe who had been a distant relative of one of the captives. This register was proof that the women had never been reassigned or left the temple. It recorded their true names, the dates they entered their service, and, crucially, a series of simple marks beside the last entry, 3 vertical lines and a single circle. The hidden truth was revealed by translating those symbols, matching them to obscure temple practices concerning death during sacred confinement. It did not denote a natural death. It meant ritual preservation in place. The priests had not killed the women because killing them would have violated the sacred ground and created a political scandal. Instead, they ensured the women lived out their natural lives in the sealed cells, without communication, without light, and without comfort. This was worse than death. It was the ultimate cold act of bureaucratic negation. They were made to vanish while still drawing breath. Their service rendered an eternal, silent imprisonment designed solely to protect, the financial claim of the priesthood. They were preserved not as martyrs, but as assets, locked away until the assets could be legally claimed. The greatest crime was not the taking of life, but the theft of visibility. The scent of ancient wax preserved a truth the stones refused to tell. The meticulous cruelty continued even after the final breath left the numbered bodies. Official temple records show the systematic erasure of the Neger-Sanit lineage. In the great limestone accounting ledgers stored in Alexandria, the scribes received specific orders: burn the old entries, use no ink to record the final service of the 27 names. Instead, the spaces where their accounts should have closed were left blank entries, great pale rectangles of unwritten history, designed to sever the lineage from its property forever. Their names were withheld from the official rosters of the deceased, denying them the necessary rites of passage. The temple calendar maintained the lie, skipping over the days of their forced confinement as if they had simply ceased to exist. Distant witnesses, low-level attendants, and outer court workers would later speak of soft, high-pitched chanting that sometimes echoed from beneath the temple foundations late at night. Whispers of women's voices, too faint to be proof, too persistent to be dismissed as fancy. These became the folk tales of the region, the ghosts of the silent vow, known only to those who lived close to the temple's colossal stones. They served as a cultural memory, a subtle defiance against the institutional lie. The ultimate fate of the temple virgins was not the sword or the poison, but the cold, slow negation of their existence. The act that began their ordeal, the sealing of the copper scroll, returns as an echo. The chief priest's hand, pressing the thick, cold beeswax into the basin, was not sealing a death warrant, but a deed of ownership. He was ensuring that their living service, their pure devotion, became the means of their disappearance, all to transfer sacred wealth. What Egyptian priests did to temple virgins was worse than death, because it took everything that follows death: memory, ritual, and a name among the ancestors. They were forced to inhabit the world as ghosts until they became them, leaving behind only the 27 cold river stones as evidence. Subscribe, hit the bell, and like. The greatest monuments are often built over the greatest silences.